Good morning, everyone. So glad to have you all on this Zoom. It is my great pleasure to introduce our three panelists, and we want to be as judicious with the short amount of time we have. So I'm going to jump right in. The purpose of this fireside chat is really to glean some wisdom from the experience and observation of our three panelists who have all had success in the cultivation of affordable or workforce housing. And those of us that are listening in are very eager to learn about your experiences, your success, perhaps some of the roadblocks or cul-de-sacs you found yourself in as well, because the group that's listening in today is committed to creating opportunity to either develop or sustain the affordable and workforce housing in our community, seeing it as a valuable economic asset to keeping this community strong and healthy. So with that, coffee, tea, soda, whatever you need for the next hour, I'd like to first start by welcoming our panelists. We have with us the Reverend Dr. Joseph Clifford, and I'm assuming we go by Joe, right? Dr. Clifford was invited to join us through an invitation from Kathy Swan. So thank you, Kathy, for making that happen. Joe is the pastor and head of staff at Myers Park Presbyterian in Charlotte. He began his ministry there in 2016. Myers Park is a congregation of 4,800 members with a vibrant ministry, numerous outreach programs, and a community development corporation focused on Grier Heights as the most challenged neighborhood in one of the most challenged neighborhoods in Charlotte. Joe serves on the board of the Mountain Retreat Association, Montreat, as well as the board of Crossroads Community Development Corporation. Prior to coming to Myers Park Presbyterian, Joe served as pastor for First Presbyterian Church at Dallas, Texas. The church is best known for its community ministry with people who are homeless and with children and youth living in poverty. Prior to Dallas, he served two congregations in the Atlanta area, Stockbridge Presbyterian and Alpharetta Presbyterian. At Alpharetta, he was part of a team that founded Drake House, which provides transitional housing for families living in poverty. He's a graduate of Columbia Theological Seminary, earned his Doctor of Ministry in Preaching from McCormick Theological Seminary, and his thesis, Far Fear to Freedom, Self-Differentiated Preaching in an Age of Anxiety, wow, applied family systems theory to the functioning of the preacher. Did I get all that right, Joe? Do you remember all that? That actually happened. Okay, good. His undergraduate degree is from Auburn, where he majored in economics and went on to a career in banking and finance before discerning a call to ministry and going to seminary. Grew up in Washington, D.C., son of two public school teachers. He and his wife, Jennifer, met at Auburn. They have two children. Welcome, Joe. Lejla. Lejla, I've been practicing your last name. Lejla Prljaca. Am I close?
Very close.
How do you say it? How would you say it?
It's Prljaca.
Prljaca.
Okay. Just Lejla's fine.
Lejla. Welcome, Lejla. Lejla came to us through Denise Vitcher, who works in leadership with St. Vincent de Paul. Thank you so much, Denise, for inviting Lejla. Lejla serves jointly as the executive director of the Lawrenceville Housing Authority and CEO of the Gwinnett Housing Corporation. Utilizing partnerships and her in-depth industry knowledge, Lejla has navigated the highly complex arena of affordable housing funding to exemplify how affordable housing development mitigates social concerns while simultaneously serving as a multiplier for local economic activity. Since 2007, her organizational researches have been leveraged to produce over 80 million in local economic development activity. Leah's creative and innovative leadership style uses evidence-based programming to merge traditional affordable housing models with community evidence-based programming based on a development focus that has established best practices in creating home ownership opportunities for transitional housing residents, modifying how credit agencies utilize rental payment history to determine credit worthiness, utilizing down payment assistance to significantly increase homeowner equity, in illustrating how the rehabilitation of affordable housing increases the overall neighborhood value, among other things. Her local community development leadership has collectivized resources to mitigate crisis situations such as COVID-19. Her outcomes have drawn widespread attention from organizations such as National Low Income Housing Coalition due to her ability to create new data sets on precariously housed residents previously absent from socioeconomic studies. Lejla is involved in the Georgia Initiative for Community Housing, Lawrenceville Response Center, the Georgia Association of Housing Redevelopment Authorities, the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, the Homeless Continuum of Care, and the Gwinnett County Housing Authority, the Regional Housing Task Force. Leah, I am overwhelmed by how accomplished you are. Thank you. We're so glad to have you. And then James. James Alexander is here at the invitation of Jack Murphy. James, we're so glad to have you. James Alexander has served as president of Mercy Housing Southeast since October 2017. Mercy Housing develops affordable housing and owns over 3,000 units in Atlanta, Savannah, and other southeastern metropolitan areas. He has worked in various leadership and project management roles in affordable housing, community development, and real estate for over 15 years, focused on creating quality, stable foundations for families and communities with a variety of incomes. So I think we can all agree why the committee was so excited to have you all on board. We are eager to hear about your experiences and your observations. And I'm going to start with you, Joe, and I'm going to go to Lejla and James. And we're just going to jump in. In your experience with creating housing opportunities for people who are financially vulnerable, what would you describe as a good starting point? So for this issue to generate this opportunity for those in the community that are financially vulnerable, where would you advise us to start?
So I'm honored to be on this panel with James and Lejla, and I want to start by saying they're the experts. I'm a minister, so my answer from the standpoint as a pastor is we started with relationships in Grier Heights, which is the neighborhood that we do our work in, and that I think the most important thing that I could say is to begin with relationships in the communities that you seek to partner with. And so our church had a relationship with Grier Heights Presbyterian Church, which was in the neighborhood, and the Antioch Baptist Church, which was also in the neighborhood. And that's the starting point, to start with the people in the community where you want to work and to find out what's important to them, what their hopes and dreams are for their community. Again, from our standpoint, there's sort of the macro issue of affordable housing in Charlotte, but for the church, the starting point was relationship with the community with work. A lot of these communities have a lot of outside forces that come in and tell them what they need, and that creates great animosity, and it's not helpful in the long run. And so that would be my counsel. Start with relationships in the places you want to work.
Great. Lejla, what advice do you have for us?
Yeah, so I want to echo on that. I think it's really important. When those relationships and having, I cannot stress how important it is to have people that are, on the ground and regularly communicating. For example, when we created the Lawrenceville Response Center, for COVID-19, we focused mostly on homeless prevention. We were able to raise money and open our doors virtually in April, which is 5 months before CARES Act funding became available. One of the main reasons for that was that we had a nonprofit who had relationships with families living in extended stays already, and we could just dive into working with them as opposed to spending months and months of establishing those relationships and trust. They also had those relationships with the property managers. So we could immediately establish those communications with them to set up for payment assistance and the reimbursements. For me, when it comes to affordable housing, just like Joe said, there are a lot of theories out there. A lot of people have opinions on how things should be done. One thing that we were most proud of is creating a data set, basically with our Norcross extended stay study. And the whole reason for that was to go knock the doors and talk to families and to see first step for us as service, as we provide our services, we already know that the reality on the ground was that many of the families in Gwinnett County are precariously housed and they're literally resorting to living in extended stays. Nobody knew what that extent was. And that's why we did our study to find out how prevalent is this problem? And then what are the barriers for them to become, to find more permanent housing? And that is what opened the doors for us to bring in not just the resources, but it's basically we're developing policy based on what is actually happening on the ground as opposed to what somebody further up the hierarchy thinks, needs to happen in the community. And that's, I think, why we were so effective with Denise and Simmons and DePaul when we created that Motel to Home program, because we knew going in exactly what the families needed. They needed down payment assistance for the apartments, the deposits, and the 30% of them had really, poor credit. So I would echo relationships and also try to define what the problem is. And once you have the data, and sometimes you have to create your own data set if that information is not out there. For us, all of us knew there were thousands of people in the extended stays. We just didn't know exactly how many. And once we created that data set, there was no denying the extent of the problem. And we also had very specific policy recommendations that came out of that because we talked with the families directly.
Great. Thank you. James, what would your suggestion be for a starting point to launch an initiative?
Sure, and maybe I'll say just a little bit about affordable housing and Mercy in our perspective. So you mentioned we're a nonprofit. We are a subsidiary of a national organization called Mercy Housing Inc. That was founded by Sisters of Mercy about 39 years ago in Omaha, Nebraska. And so I'm the president of the Southeast office of it. And we develop affordable housing. And I think our take on it, just as Lejla said, there's a variety of different approaches to affordable housing. I think, it's important for a community to take a broad perspective, but our perspective on it and approach has been creating rental affordable housing for low-income families. And we mainly do that through the low-income housing tax credit program. And for us, at the end of the day, it's really about making sure that the people who live in the housing are able to thrive. I think that's both seniors and also families. So we're also excited to be here, and that just kind of gives you a flavor about the perspective that we're coming from. I kind of disagree with what Joe said up front about experts and non-experts in the field. I don't think that this is rocket science, and I think a lot of it, in terms of a starting point, comes down to some of those fundamentals that Lejla talked about. So, what's the demand and need for affordable housing? in your community or communities, or if you're looking at a particular site, you know, what's the greatest need? Is it for very low income families, you know, working for less than minimum wage? Is it people who, you know, are looking to get in the for sale market, to get their kids in the school district, and they just, you know, can't find a place to buy? So I think, you know, really identifying what the need is in your communities, and then starting to collect some of the data that you can use to take forward as you build your advocacy and platform, you know, much like the study that Lejla did. I think, you know, also, you know, the relationships, as both Joe and Lejla mentioned, you know, is absolutely important. You know, I'd say, as you know, you're thinking about a specific development, and again, I think that's kind of our perspective and our work. You know, we often begin with, you know, what's the compelling need or story for this development to exist? Because I think the fact is that there is no single process to get these affordable housing developments done. And for the most part, they feel kind of impossible throughout the process. And you really need that compelling story and relationship so that people are making exceptions for you throughout the process. And so I think building those relationships and building what that compelling story is for your advocacy or for your development is a really important starting point.
Thank you so much, James. Picking up on something you just said, people are willing to make exceptions, moves me into another question that we had thought about, which is any experience or suggestion as to how to effectively engage the private sector, particularly the business community, whether it's for financial support or assistance in creating space, assistance in overcoming political obstacles, or just perception. But specifically, there was a lot of curiosity on our part about those relationships and engagement with the private sector, the business community. So we'll work backwards. I'll start with you, James, and then we'll go to Lejla and Joe.
Yeah, I think with the work that we do, there is typically a moment where we have to ask the county, the town, or the city that we're in for permission via zoning to build. Mm-hmm. Usually the sites that we acquire are not suited for affordable housing. And that's where many of the challenges lie, is, you know, you have many neighbors who are wary of affordable housing, you know, for the tenancy the tenants who live there. In some cases, it's the density and the traffic. And so I think from the business community's perspective, you know, having a yes in my backyard approach and having a willingness to stay plugged into zoning meetings at your local town or city and showing up. And you know, y'all have all had this experience where, you know, the people who show up for things are the people who are against something. The people who don't show up are the people who either support it or mildly support it. And I think, you know, actually having people from the business community show up to support these developments at key moments, I think is really huge. I think the second thing is, there's just I think a different relationship between the business community and elected officials than between nonprofits and elected officials. We see elected officials all the time, and they kind of say, oh, well, here they come, and we know what they're going to talk about, and we know what their issue is. But to have, people from the business community singing from a similar song sheet and talking about how it's important for the community, for that business's employees, gets elected officials to listen differently. So I think, the business community coming together and, creating a platform to advocate alongside nonprofits or on their own is extremely important in advancing affordable housing in the community.
Okay. Lejla, what are your thoughts on
I agree
partnering
with
with the business community? Or go ahead.
Yeah. No, I agree with it. We as a nonprofit and our housing authority is a quasi-governmental entity. We cannot, we do not have, unfortunately, the same weight in spreading this message as the private sector does in terms of, getting the attention of the elected officials. Whenever we would partner with the private sector, that is exactly when we got the most done. And what we've done is several developments that we actually have in the pipeline. We have a neighborhood that is, we're developing single family homes for first time income eligible home buyers. And the other two, we partnered with a very reputable tax credit developer. We're developing two sites, one for the families, one for elderly. And how the elected officials really got on board is that when we showed to them that we are interested not in bringing slum or bringing projects, because that's typically what people associate with affordable housing. Right. I mean, it took me a couple of years to show this is what affordable housing looks like, and we would take them to tax credit development. So we had to actually take our elected officials outside of their box and show to them that affordable housing to us is a private sector product. But because this is a public-private partnership, we bring the subsidy and it's needed to make it affordable. But the end result is no different than another development that's completely privately developed, just down the street. So once we were able to show and demonstrate and show specific examples of how our partnership with the private sector is going to bring that private sector product into their community, that's when we really started to make a lot of progress. Another thing, in addition to everything that James said, in terms of advocacy, I think COVID-19 really exposed the need for public-private nonprofit collaboration. When we started our Lawrenceville Response Center, sorry, I have my son here. I'm doing digital learning. So when we started Lawrenceville Response Center back in April, we've invested, this is just inside the city of Lawrenceville, we invested $300,000, pumped it into the local rental economy. This is a city of 30,000, so that was a very sizable investment. And without that cash infusion very early into the COVID-19, that I wonder how they would be doing right now without it. However, when we turned around to ask the private sector, hey, we're getting $1 million more in CARES Act funding. Is there a way in order for us to make that money to spread it out? Can you maybe waive the late fee? And that's when we got a lot of pushback. And I was really surprised by that. And I think those conversations need to be how synergistic public and private sector is. That the private sector really did get affected tremendously by COVID-19. And they accepted, hundreds of thousands of dollars of public funds to keep them afloat. And because there's that relationship, I think there needs to be more give and take. And finally, when we talk about the private sector, everybody wants to know how an affordable housing product will it disrupt the local economy and what impact it will have. And that's something that I share with the county elected officials on a regular basis, is that affordable housing is part of economic development, and our economic health hinges on availability of quality affordable housing. It all boils down to discretionary income. And if all of our families are cost burdened and 60, 70, 80% of their income goes towards housing, guess what? They're not going to have that much income left over to spend in the local economy. And that's, and I even tell them when they send scouts for businesses, they look at statistics and census data to see how much discretionary income there is in the community, how much purchasing power there is in the community. And if vast majority of people in a particular census tract are spending 80% of their income towards housing, guess what? The businesses are not going to move there. And I think that also we need to frame that discussion, that we are absolutely interdependent on each other.
I like that. Joe.
I agree with everything that's been said in terms of political leverage and changing public perceptions. And I think the best way that the private sector can help is cash for financing. So in Charlotte, we had a horrible thing happen in 2016 that ended up being a tremendous blessing for affordable housing. Charlotte was ranked in a study by Stanford University 50th out of 50 in terms of major metropolitan areas for the possibility of children to get out of poverty. And I'm so thankful that we came in last. If we had come in 47th, nothing would have happened. But we were so embarrassed that we came in last that it really mobilized the community. And so publicly, the city council put forward a $50 million bond issue for an affordable housing fund. And then in the private sector, through our community foundation, the Foundation for the Carolinas, they raised another $50 million to match it. They actually raised $53 million. So we've got a housing fund, private housing fund that's managed by LISC, which is a national organization that Lejla and James are shaking their head. They're a big player in this space. And they provide gap financing for projects. Then in addition to that, the corporate community and private business community, developers donating land for projects that helps make them cash flow, particularly projects that are aimed at 30% AMI, people who are making 30% of the area median income, which is where our big deficit is in Charlotte. Those are really hard to cash flow, and you can't do it without free land or really low cost financing. You can do 80% AMI, and we actually have an abundance of that, but our problem is in 30% AMI. So donating land that's available. We had a sandwich shop in Charlotte that donated 3 acres. They're building 24 townhomes on that. That'll be for people making 60% AMI. The banks have pledged not only grants, but also low income financing for projects. And then we've got a lot of businesses. These are larger businesses that provide rent subsidies for their employees. So like the hospitals, their hours are so huge that, and most employees at a hospital can't afford the housing around the hospital. So the hospital puts in a rent subsidy for their employees, which helps them live close to the hospital and helps working class folks be able to afford the housing that's in the community. So those are some ways that I think the private sector can help.
What is the name of the project or program that does the gap funding?
So it's the Charlotte Housing Opportunity Investment Fund is what it's called. The money was raised by the Foundation for the Carolinas, which was our community. I'm sure North Fulton County or Fulton County has a community fund like that. And it's managed by LISC, LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation is what that stands for. And again, James and Lejla, I'm sure, are familiar with them.
Okay, Lejla, I would like to start with you this time, and we wanted to glean from you something in the arena of your creativity or your imagination. How do you and your colleagues get creative about repurposing properties? Where you had mentioned outside the box. What do you think it takes to push past what's in front of us and use our imagination and our creativity to think about repurposing space and creating opportunity in an innovative way?
Okay, so it was a loaded question. Creating opportunities. So for me, in Gwinnett County, we're really lagging behind the conversations. It's right now kind of, we're picking up speed and momentum. But when we started to create our Pathway Home program, and that is a program for transitional housing for homeless families with children. We actually did a big So we realized that there are a lot of organizations in Gwinnett County that do a really good job with case management and providing those wraparound services, but they just did not have stable housing to put their families in on a temporary basis while they work on those programs. So we, as an organization, we shifted focus because we have development experience, and we said we're going to get out of case management, social services. We're just going to focus on affordable housing production. And one thing for us, honestly, if we were to take no for an answer every time that answer was given to us, we wouldn't have built anything. So the creative way of thinking, to me, it's even how do you sell a product to a government entity? And the way that you do that is hear their concerns. And that was obviously, to me, it was like, don't you just get it? But once we started those conversations, they really had some legitimate concerns. And once I knew what those concerns are, then you turn on the creative side and figure out how do we make this work for everybody. So with our Pathway Home program, we insisted that we acquire these units that were typically foreclosed and that they be scattered approach. We did not want to concentrate everybody in one location. And that scared a lot of people. And you have to understand, this was about 10 years ago in Gwinnett County. It raised a lot of eyebrows, like, you mean be right next to me? And once I understood, they didn't say it literally in those words, but that was the message. So, we phrased it as the unit is for sale and it gets sold to somebody. So would you rather it be owned and managed by an entity that's been in your community since 1950, that is responsive to the community, run by community, or maybe some, international investment company and, that they're going to manage it from New York? So once we started phrasing those conversations, how this is mutually beneficial to everybody that works. We did the same thing with the city of Lawrenceville. They wanted to revitalize their downtown, and our, public housing stock was in the way. And, we approached them and said, well, look, I know that you need us to relocate this. So let's talk, how much is it worth it to you? And we got a really good deal out of it. They ended up replacing 36 of our public housing units at no cost to us. And they were literally moved just down the block. So it's not like we sent them, in some obscure location. The financing component of it, we are more and more looking into leveraging public funds that we get with the private sector funding. And then, that can get more technical, but bottom line is, for me, is just when somebody tells you no, trust me, there's always a back door that you can get into. As long as this is what you wish, and if you listen, there's a way to make this work for everybody that's involved.
Thank you, Lejla. James, what are your thoughts on how to get creative, how to not get stuck in traditional approaches, how to look at repurposing, properties and communicating with some imagination and persuasion?
Well, I think in terms of repurposing spaces, there's a lot of folks across the country who are looking at hotels right now because of what the pandemic has done to that sector of real estate. And depending on the, kind of outlook in the company, there are some who are saying, well, we just need to wait, it's coming back. And there are others who are willing to sell. And we have not done this, but we know that folks are in the kind of middle stages of figuring out how to acquire these hotels and repurpose them for affordable housing. Whenever there is some form of a downturn, there are also opportunities to repurpose spaces. So I think that's one idea. I think the idea that Joe mentioned is a really good one, and I think we're seeing this more and more. It's businesses with excess land, or churches or nonprofits with excess land. In a lot of suburban communities, they are really overbuilt for parking, in particular, way more than is necessary. And really all it takes is, an acre or an acre and a half to deliver, 50, 60 units. So a sandwich shop, as Joe mentioned, or a business who's willing to say, we don't need all this parking, or a large retail power center saying, we really don't need all this parking, and being able to dedicate that to affordable housing, I think is useful. And, it's the kind of thinking that is already happening in terms of creating out parcels for small CVSs, or small stores, but, really, thinking about approaching those large centers to create spaces for affordable housing. And I think the last thing I'll mention, there's a lot of talk and discussion about accessory dwelling units. Do folks kind of know what that is?
Why don't you go ahead and paint a picture?
Yeah, so in where there is a single family home, and there is extra space on the lot, there are many people who are building. Hello?
Yep. Tiny homes or
yeah,
or
sorry,
second.
I had the blue screen of death for a second. We came back. A small home on the side or in the back that someone can rent. And that requires the city to allow a zoning designation for single family homeowners to be able to do that. It benefits the homeowner in that they're able to bring in additional revenue off of land that they may not use that much. It also creates low-cost housing for people who want to live in that housing. And it's also a way for individuals to contribute to the solution of affordable housing, as opposed to having to, advocate a larger community to act in mass. It's something that an individual can do to, contribute to solving the problem.
Joe, help us think outside the box.
Yeah, I've put up a couple of links to projects. Lejla and James have been given examples to see what that's looked like in Charlotte, and that might stoke some imagination. I think I'm going to put up another link from the Housing Fund and one of our partners in the homeless ministry space above here in Charlotte. They've just helped get financing for a purchase of $58 million purchase of an apartment complex that will preserve naturally occurring affordable housing, NOAA. That's a huge sector that I don't think we pay enough attention to. It's a whole lot easier to to save affordable housing than to build it. And so I think Lejla's given a good example of that, what that looked like in terms of trying to save the that housing, government housing. So within the church, our Crossroads is a community development. Their primary energy is building affordable houses. So we've built 41 units, but again, those were at 80% AMI. Now our attention is on 30 to 60%. We're partnering to do multifamily, but critical housing repair is part of that, and trying to help people stay in their homes when they can't afford massive repair. That's another way to help. And I think outside the box, I've got a member of our church who's a successful real estate developer. And I said, how are you being impacted by COVID? And he said, well, and we were at a place outside eating lunch, and he pointed to the skyline of Charlotte. He said, if you're building those, you're in big trouble in terms of big office buildings. And I think you're going to see a lot of opportunity for repurposing of these big office spaces, because I think people are learning that office space is not as needed as we thought it was. And I'm wondering what that's going to look like going forward when we have, lots of downtown skyscrapers that are empty because their offices aren't going to be utilized anymore on anywhere near the same level. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for repurposing that space for housing. So.
Good. Thank you. We have about 15 minutes or so left, and I want to leave some time at the end for questions that reach beyond my preparation and the group's suggestions. But I would like, and Joe, I'm going to go to you at the end, because I would like to hear from James and Lejla in particular, because they're not directly tied to the work that comes from the faith-based community. What if well, I guess, James, you are working with the nuns and Mercy Housing, but let's start with Lejla. What role did faith-based communities play in your work, if any? Mm-hmm. And how did you leverage those relationships? And then advice from James and Joe about the unique relationship of the faith-based community to this kind of work for families and communities. So Lejla?
And again, I think there's a lot of synergy between what we do, because we're all, mission oriented and our missions are aligned. The very first time I had an opportunity to work with a representative of the faith community was in Norcross, when we were questioning one of the ordinances that they passed. And I always say it's important to have somebody, a representative from there, because they have that moral authority. And it's hard to not listen to somebody affiliated with the church. So not just in terms of advocacy, but more practically, we, with the Lawrenceville Response, we want to not just help people stay housed during the pandemic or until the unemployment benefits become available. We wanted to take this opportunity to build our capacity organizationally, so we can continue doing this, on a larger scale. The faith community, not only we raise record like $150,000 in just 1 week, but the different churches came in specializing in different arenas. One specifically was Lawrenceville Employment Assistance Program. They got their volunteers who are already trained, and they were able to assist all of our clients as employment coaches to help them navigate back to employment. And we had the clients that they touched had the most success. Some of them actually increased their earnings by $5-6 more an hour than before COVID-19. So it's that individual touch that they were able to give. When it comes to affordable housing development, it's really interesting. With Gwinnett being mostly developed, and now we're looking at how do we repurpose some of the buildings. I was in a conversation with one of the list representatives for Norcross and Peachtree Corners, and she says that there's willingness from the churches to do more. And there were some conversations floating around to do more in terms of affordable housing, that maybe they should pull their resources and purchase an apartment. I talked them out of it because it's just not cost effective. Right now, the rents are so high that the cost just to acquire one building would be humongous. But I said, what churches have that's in high demand right now is land. And I said, don't, even if it's an acre or two here and there, people sometimes get focused on a big project, but a dozen smaller projects throughout the county, it adds up and it can actually have a much bigger impact. So we started those conversations and they took it seriously. We're already talking to a church in Norcross, and they have 12 acres of land, and they are thinking of separating and donating or selling half of that to build affordable housing. And they would also be able to provide their services to the clients that are housed. So I think they definitely, especially in the creation of affordable housing, they can play a very big role, considering, the land ownership.
So any insider tips on how to cultivate, leverage, create relationships with the community that enhance workforce or affordable housing opportunities and projects?
Well, first, if you bring us food, we'll always listen. I think James and Lejla have mentioned it. I think the key, where the church is in and institutional religion is in a tremendous shift in our society, and we're in a post-religious society. We are no longer in the position of power and influence that were in the 20th century. And I think that's probably a really good thing for the church. I can just speak from the Christian standpoint. I think a shift in thinking needs to happen among Christians, that the church exists for the sake of the world and not the other way around. I think we have historically thought that the world existed to provide us with members, and I think we need a shift in ecclesiology and the thinking about the church, that the church exists for the sake of the world. And in the Presbyterian church, and certainly in a lot of Protestant churches, one thing the church has, as has been mentioned, is a lot of land, and it's not being utilized. And I doubt that it ever will be. Right now, 80% of Presbyterian churches in the country have less than 100 members. The vast majority cannot sustain a full-time clergy, and they're sitting on huge resources of land. And so there's stories all over the country about churches. I would not advise selling land to a church. I would advise that the church create a lease, a long-term lease for $1 or something, so that the church maintains control to ensure that it's always going to be affordable housing. I think that's a real challenge, especially with tax credit deals that have, anyway, land is a huge thing that the church can provide. And I think from a theological standpoint, just grounding in that concept that the church exists for the sake of the world. This is what God calls us to do in the model of Jesus Christ. Christ gave his life for the world. And I think in this matter, the church is in a position to give something of ourselves to the world. I think that's for struggling churches. There are very vital churches out there. Obviously, I'm blessed to be a part of one. And another creative way that churches can do this is if churches have endowed funds, endowments. We've got churches right now that are taking portions of their endowments and using them for, instead of investing in bonds, they're using that portion of their endowed funds to finance affordable housing projects. So our church just recently lent $1 million at 0% interest to buy land in Grier Heights for an affordable housing development in partnership with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Housing Partners. And so that we're at 0%, and then we're putting together the deal now. Once the financing comes through, will probably be a part of the long-term financing of that project as well. Again, not a lot of churches can do that, but there's a lot of mega churches in Atlanta that could absolutely do that, and having their own members challenge them to do that. And I think that's an incredibly faithful use of funds that the church has acquired through the years. And again, it's a win-win. If the church can finance it at 1.5%, if they can use that money at 1.5%, they're going to make as much money doing that as they would in the bond market. So it's not asking the church to make a tremendous sacrifice. In our instance, at 0%, but again, that doesn't cost us that much. And the benefit of that is far greater. So our church just believed we were called to do that. And we're in the midst of a capital campaign, and we're going to try to raise a housing fund as part of that of $3 million to be able to do that over and over again and help projects happen.
Joe, I'm curious, then I've got to release the mic to the group. And James, if you want to add something quickly, but I know that there are people in this group that want to ask questions, and if some people want to put questions in chat, that might be helpful too. Joe, I'm curious, that remarkable investment that your church is making in Charlotte, did that come at the behest of your leadership? Are you casting that vision first?
I'm not going to take credit for that. I mean, I think
I know.
It's part of what's happening in Charlotte right now. Again, because we came in last. I mean, that was really embarrassing. It was the best thing that could have happened to us, because people were like, hey, that's not who we are as a city, and we need to do better. So I think what I've done is taken advantage of a great opportunity because there's an openness. And again, our church isn't the only one doing that. Covenant Presbyterian in Charlotte lent $2 million for an affordable housing project.
Right.
So, it's not an idea that's original to me. And
but you are articulating it, championing it, bringing it up, shining some light on the issue.
Yeah. And again, our church founded Crossroads in 2008. So I didn't come to Myers Park till 2016. So the church has a heart for this. Yeah.
Good. James, anything that you want to add in this arena?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'd add is that Enterprise Community Partners has a faith-based development initiative that they're putting together in the Atlanta area. And there's likely to be a number of around that and learnings around that. So I'd encourage folks to stay tuned related to that.
Great. We have just a very few minutes. Who has a question that we haven't asked of our experts?
I saw something about Habitat in the chat, and our church has partnered with Habitat. I think they're a wonderful community initiative. The biggest challenge for Habitat is scale. But again, in Fulton County and North Fulton, Habitat's doing big stuff, and they're an amazing organization and a critical part of the team. But that's just a response to something I saw in the chat while there was that quiet moment.
I think James just mentioned the Enterprise Community Partnership. Is that right, James?
Enterprise Community Partners.
Yeah.
And if I can find more information about that initiative, I can put it in the chat or forward it to the group afterwards.
Anyone else have a question? I'm just curious, what are you all working on right now? What's right in front of you? James, you're on my screen.
Oh, wow. I'm working on a fair amount. We have a development under construction in Savannah, Georgia. And that's going to be 85 units, and it's the final phase of a 10-year revitalization initiative. We're going to be breaking ground in a couple of weeks on a development in Greenville, South Carolina. And finally, there's a development we should be breaking ground on in the first part of this year, just to the east of downtown Atlanta, in partnership with a group called Project Community Connections, Inc. And that is an example of, where a nonprofit saw the land that they had, and put together some resources to work with an architect to come up with the concept for the site. They got it rezoned and they put it out for bid to developers. And so that space is going to include affordable rental housing for low-income families. It's going to include permanent supportive housing for those who are formerly or were formerly homeless. And it's also going to include the office space for Project Community Connections, Inc., which is a rapid rehousing organization, and much more.
Nice.
So yeah, we're really excited about those. And we're also looking to build new pipelines. So if anybody knows of any opportunities, please feel free to reach out to me or someone on my team.
Great. Thank you. Lejla, what's caught your attention right now?
So we have a couple of projects in the pipeline as well. Somebody mentioned the importance of preservation, and that is absolutely paramount. And as part of our strategic reorganizing, we put that as one of our priorities. We are putting a financing or capital plan together to recapitalize all of our public housing that has not been demolished and replaced. And we also, working with the city of Lawrenceville, we applied for a CHIP grant. Can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a DCA grant. And it's for homeowner rehab. The city of Lawrenceville is going to send us all of their code violators to us. And our in-house general contractor is going to work with just helping those homeowners. They have to be income eligible. So we want to make sure that people don't lose housing because they're unable to make some expensive repairs that are required by the city code. And on the other hand, again, maintaining that relationship with the city, we're helping them improve the aesthetics of the neighborhood. So we're focusing on preservation and then the creation as well for the building those 2 tax credit developments in a single family home subdivision for first-time home buyers. In Gwinnett County, median sales price has increased 48% in the last 5 years. So it's harder and harder for the first-time home buyers to break into the market. And that's where we're restructuring as well. And one of my, something that I'm passionate about is once that extended stay study came out with the city of Norcross, that showed 84% of the people who responded actually use that as a place of residence. We know, again, just from personal experience and working in this industry, how the effect that it has on the schools and the transiency that happens when these students, have to switch multiple schools with academic year. And that's something that I'm talking to some of the elected officials now to get the land either from the faith community or acquire that's closer to the schools to bring transitional housing, particularly for those students, so they can finish out the school year without having to move. So quite a few projects in the pipeline, but the list is always growing.
Joe, real quick, I'm on the clock.
Gotcha. That land that we helped to finance is going to break ground this year on 60, hopefully 68 units. We're still finalizing the design of that. And then our coalition with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Housing Partner has just been awarded an RFP for 286 mixed-use units, ownership as well as rental. And 188 of those units will be for people earning less than 60% of the area median income. The last thing I want to say, which we get to the question about what have we learned and what mistakes have we made. And I would say Myers Park Presbyterian Church is a very white church, and it's a wealthy church. And we have learned a lot in working with a predominantly African-American community in Grier Heights. And I would tell any church, especially a white church that's interested in getting involved in this, that it is critically to engage in cross-cultural competencies and to understand the dynamics of race and the history of the communities that you're engaging with. Our church, we've made a lot of mistakes in that, and we've been very white, and our whiteness has impacted our efforts. And so to particularly white congregations that are interested in wanting to do help and do good things, I would highly encourage that any community involved in that you do some anti-racism training with that community and with yourselves before you get into that community, because there is a lot of freight there, and I've seen far too many well-intentioned white people do harm, and I don't want to contribute to that in any way. So those are lessons we've learned along the way, and thankfully our partners are hanging with us, and I'm thankful for that, but we've made our mistakes there. That's a whole nother panel, by the way. But
that is, and again, I would be remiss without thanking everyone for the time today. I'm an optimist by nature, and often these discussions don't lead to optimistic outcomes, but certainly today there's a strong sense of optimism that there are opportunities and solutions. And so thank you to the panel. Thank you to the team. Jack, I'm handing the baton to you.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, panelists. This has been incredible. And for those of you that participated, we appreciate that. If you want more information, please sign up on our improvenorthfulton.org website. Next month's Fireside Chat will deal with food insecurity. And we know that all these issues are connected. So we hope you will be back with us next month. This will be recorded, and we will be sending it out to you and to others that are on our email list. So again, thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants, and have a great day.
Thanks, y'all.